We're replacing you with someone younger. Company fires 55-year-old. Collapses 3 months later without her. She walked into the office on a Monday morning with her reputation intact and her expertise undeniable. She left that Friday with a termination letter and the message that the company was moving in a different direction. The morning sun cast shadows across the lobby of Sterling Engineering when Catherine arrived at work like she had for the past 18 years. Her clothes were professional, her hair streaked with silver, and the confidence in her bearing reflected someone who knew their value within the organization. But her eyes, despite their brightness, would soon carry the weight of unexpected rejection and betrayal by people she had trained and mentored. Richard was sitting in his office when Catherine arrived, along with 2 members of the Human Resources Department. They looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with papers and avoiding direct eye contact. The company's new CEO, Brandon, stood by the window with his arms crossed, clearly prepared for this meeting but showing no actual discomfort. Catherine immediately sensed something was wrong, some shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't quite identify yet. "Catherine, thank you for coming in," Brandon said, not bothering to gesture toward a seat. "We need to have a difficult conversation with you this morning about your position here." Catherine felt her stomach tighten instinctively. She had just completed a major project 2 weeks ago, a bridge design that had exceeded all specifications and won industry recognition. "Is there a problem with the Henderson Bridge project?" The client was thrilled with the design. The structural integrity exceeded their expectations significantly. "No, the project is fine," Richard said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "The work itself has been acceptable," Brandon continued, "but we've decided that the company needs to evolve. We're implementing a new strategic direction, one that requires younger energy and different perspectives. We've determined that your position is redundant with our new organizational structure." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "My position is redundant? I manage 3 major client relationships. I oversee the structural analysis department. I've been responsible for quality control on every significant project we've completed for a decade." One of the HR representatives cleared her throat. "We'll be distributing your responsibilities among several younger team members. They bring fresh ideas and lower salary requirements. The company is experiencing budget constraints, and this restructuring will help us remain competitive in a changing market." Catherine understood immediately what was happening, though she couldn't quite believe it was happening to her. "You're replacing me with cheaper, younger staff. We're making strategic business decisions," Brandon said, his tone suggesting this conversation was already finished in his mind. "Nothing personal. You've had a good run here." "A good run?" Catherine's voice remained steady, though anger was building beneath the surface. "I've built half the systems that keep this company functioning. I've trained every senior engineer on your current staff. I brought in over $40 million in contracts through my client relationships." Richard, who had worked alongside Catherine for 12 years, still couldn't meet her eyes. "You can take the rest of the day to gather your personal items. Security will escort you out by 5 o'clock. The meeting lasted 7 minutes total. Catherine was let out by security at 5:15. By 5:30, the news had spread throughout the company. By 6 o'clock, 3 of the younger engineers had called her, expressing shock and anger at the decision. By midnight, Catherine was sitting alone in her apartment, trying to process what had happened. She had prepared for this possibility in some distant, abstract way, the way people prepare for unlikely disasters. But experiencing it was completely different. The company she had helped build from mediocrity to excellence had decided she was suddenly expendable. The people she had mentored and trained were now being given her responsibilities with half her salary. Over the following weeks, Catherine tried to focus on the positive aspects of her situation. She had savings. She had time to think about what came next. She had energy that could be directed toward a new chapter. But the sting of the betrayal was profound and complicated by something she couldn't ignore. The implicit message that she had aged out of value. Meanwhile, at Sterling Engineering, chaos began almost immediately. Richard called Catherine after 2 weeks, asking if she could recommend a solution to a problem that had emerged with the Henderson Bridge design. Catherine politely declined to help, still too raw from her dismissal. But she knew what the problem was without even hearing the details. It was something she would have caught if she was still there. Within a week, a flaw was discovered in the structural analysis that required expensive remediation. The younger engineers, despite their enthusiasm and fresh ideas, lacked the experience to catch the subtle issues that Catherine had built into her quality control processes. They worked harder, but without the intuitive understanding that comes from decades of practice. Projects that should have taken 3 weeks took 6. Costs overrun budgets. A major client, frustrated with delays and mistakes, terminated their contract. Brandon brought in consultants to fix the problems, but the solutions were expensive and time-consuming. The consulting fees alone exceeded what they would have paid Catherine for another year of employment. The budget constraints that had justified eliminating her position were rapidly disappearing. 3 months after Catherine's termination, Sterling Engineering's quarterly financial report was a disaster. They had lost 2 major contracts. Quality issues had damaged their reputation. Several other senior engineers had left the company, taking their expertise and their client relationships elsewhere. The company's stock price dropped 15% in a single week. Brandon called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. The discussion quickly shifted from strategic vision to damage control. The company needed to recover from what had become a public relations nightmare. Richard, now desperate and humiliated by the turn of events, contacted Catherine at her home. "We made a mistake," he said without preamble. "A serious mistake. The company is in crisis. We need your help." Catherine was making coffee when Richard called. She almost hung up on him immediately. Instead, she listened. "How bad is it?" she asked. 3 major contracts lost. Quality issues discovered in 2 completed projects. 2 of the best senior engineers have already left. The board is questioning whether Brandon should stay on as CEO. We need someone who understands the systems we've built and who can fix this situation. Catherine set down her coffee cup. "And you're calling me for help after you fired me for being too old and expensive?" "I know this is difficult," Richard said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "I should have fought harder when Brandon pushed for your termination. I regret that decision intensely. But the company is falling apart, Catherine. We need you. The company needs you." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "I'll consider it, but not as an employee. Not yet. I'll consult on the immediate crisis for a fixed fee. After that, we'll see." She spent the next 4 weeks at Sterling Engineering analyzing the damage. She identified the systemic failures, the places where the removal of institutional knowledge had created cascading problems. She documented everything systematically. She showed Richard and Brandon exactly how their decision to eliminate her position had created the crisis they were now experiencing. "The Henderson Bridge contract didn't fail because the design was flawed," Catherine explained to the board. "It failed because the quality control process that I had developed wasn't properly implemented by people who didn't understand why those processes existed. They saw them as bureaucratic impediments instead of as the accumulated wisdom of decades of experience." The board listened carefully. "The client relationships that walked away didn't leave because of the quality issues alone," Catherine continued. "They left because they could see that the company had lost institutional knowledge. They could see it in the way problems were handled in the delays, in the lack of confidence from the engineering team itself." Brandon realized during Catherine's presentation that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. His strategy to reduce costs had instead created an expensive crisis. The consultant fees, the remediation costs, the lost contracts, the damaged reputation had all far exceeded what he would have paid Catherine to stay employed. "What would it take to bring you back?" the board chairman asked Catherine directly. Catherine took a deep breath. "I want my position restored. I want a salary increase reflecting my value and the trust you've broken. I want a guarantee that I cannot be terminated for 5 years without cause. And I want one more thing." "What's that?" the chairman asked. "I want to establish a mentorship program within this company that ensures that institutional knowledge is never again concentrated in one person or lost through negligence and ageism. I want the company to commit to valuing experienced engineers not as costs to be eliminated, but as assets to be developed." The board agreed to all of her conditions. Within 6 months of Catherine's return, Sterling Engineering had stabilized. The quality control processes were reinstated. The younger engineers, now properly mentored by Catherine and several other senior staff, began to understand the importance of experience combined with fresh thinking. New contracts were signed, the company's reputation began to recover. But Catherine's real focus was on the mentorship program. She worked with each of the younger engineers individually, teaching them not just technical skills but also the philosophy behind the processes they followed. She showed them that efficiency wasn't about doing things faster, but about doing them correctly the first time by learning from collective experience. Richard became one of the strongest advocates for Catherine's mentorship program. He had learned his own difficult lesson about the value of institutional knowledge and about the responsibility of leadership to protect the people who make organizations function. A year after Catherine's reinstatement, Sterling Engineering was profitable again. More importantly, the company had fundamentally changed its culture. Experience was now valued. Age was no longer seen as a liability. The combination of younger energy with accumulated wisdom became the company's competitive advantage. Catherine began speaking at engineering conferences about what had happened at Sterling Engineering. Her story of termination and reinstatement became a case study in the cost of ageism to organizations. She was invited to speak about maintaining institutional knowledge and building sustainable corporate structures. Ageism is expensive, she told an audience of 500 engineering leaders. Not just in the human cost of discarding experienced professionals, but in the very real financial costs that organizations face when they lose that experience. We fired someone with 18 years of institutional knowledge to save money. Within 4 months, we had spent triple what we would have paid to keep her just to fix the problems created by her absence. The audience listened intently, many of them seeing their own organizations reflected in her story. But the real issue, Catherine continued, is that we treated a human being as disposable. We treated decades of experience and expertise as obsolete. We forgot that people are not merely cost items on a balance sheet. They are the foundation of organizational capability and resilience. 3. Years after her termination and subsequent reinstatement, Catherine established the Institute for Organizational Resilience. The mission was to help companies understand and protect institutional knowledge, to mentor senior leaders about the true cost of forced attrition of experienced employees, and to develop programs that combined the strengths of experienced and younger workers. The first clients included companies that had experienced their own versions of what happened at Sterling Engineering. Many had fired experienced employees only to discover the enormous costs involved in replacing their expertise. Others were trying to prevent that disaster from happening to them. Catherine's institute became recognized as a leader in organizational development and change management. She was invited to speak at major corporations, at business schools, at industry conferences. Her message was always the same: experience is an asset, not a liability. Wisdom cannot be cheaply replaced. And ageism in the workplace is not a moral failing alone, but also a strategic disaster. Richard eventually became CEO of Sterling Engineering after Brandon was removed by the board. His first major initiative was to establish a fellowship program for senior engineers, a systematic approach to capturing and transferring institutional knowledge before experienced staff retired. He also implemented a policy explicitly prohibiting age discrimination in hiring and termination decisions. We learned this lesson the hard way, Richard told his staff during the announcement. We lost a valued colleague and nearly lost our company because we mistakenly believed that youth and cost reduction could replace experience and wisdom. They cannot. What we need is both. What we need is a culture that values people at every stage of their career. The fellowship program became a model that other engineering firms began to emulate. Within 5 years, over 40 companies had adopted similar approaches to protecting institutional knowledge and valuing experienced employees. Catherine often reflected on the irony of her termination in return. If Sterling Engineering had simply valued her work and kept her employed, none of the crisis would have happened. If they had recognized the true cost of firing experienced employees before they made the decision, they would never have done it. But the crisis forced an important reckoning that the company might never have had otherwise. It forced leadership to confront their unconscious biases about age and value. It forced them to think systematically about knowledge transfer and organizational resilience. It forced them to recognize that people are not interchangeable, that experience cannot be quickly replicated, and that short-term cost savings often create long-term disasters. 5 years after her termination, Catherine stood in front of Sterling Engineering's annual shareholder meeting, presenting the results of the mentorship and fellowship programs. The company's profitability had grown steadily. The employee retention rate had improved significantly. The company's reputation had been fully restored. What we did 5 years ago was not uncommon, Catherine told the shareholders. Across this country, companies regularly eliminate experienced employees to reduce costs, believing that younger workers can do the same job for less money. What we discovered at Sterling Engineering is that this strategy is fundamentally flawed. She presented data showing the costs, the consulting fees required to fix problems that experienced staff would have prevented, the lost contracts, the damage to reputation, the disruption to operations, the difficulty in recruiting new talent once word spreads that the company doesn't value its people. But beyond the financial costs, Catherine continued, there is a human cost. We sent a message to our entire workforce that your value decreases with your age, that you are disposable, that the company does not appreciate your contributions. That message spread throughout the company and caused tremendous damage to morale and culture. The shareholders listened carefully to her presentation. The decision to fire me was about more than just one person, Catherine concluded. It was about the values that this company claimed to hold versus the values we actually lived. It took a crisis to force us to align those values. My hope is that other companies can learn this lesson without having to experience the same crisis. Experience is not a liability. Ageism is not just morally wrong, it is strategically destructive, and we have the data to prove it. The sun was setting over the city as Catherine left the shareholder meeting that day. Below, the streets were filled with experienced workers, many of them vulnerable to the same ageism that had nearly destroyed her career and that had nearly destroyed Sterling Engineering. Some of them were probably being pushed out of their jobs right now, replaced by younger, cheaper workers. Some of them would eventually be needed back, as it happened with Catherine, but by then, some of the damage might be irreversible. Catherine thought about the journey from that Friday when she was terminated to this moment now. It wasn't a simple story of vindication, though it contained elements of that. It was a story about the hidden costs of our biases, about the value of experience in an age obsessed with novelty, and about the surprising resilience of people who refuse to accept that their best days are behind them. It was about organizations learning to value what they had instead of chasing what they thought they wanted. Tomorrow, she would return to her work at Sterling Engineering and at her institute, mentoring leaders, helping companies avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed Sterling. But tonight, she allowed herself to observe the city, grateful for a second chance that had come only after crisis forced recognition of her value, and hopeful that her work could help others avoid having to learn this lesson through disaster.